Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine Podcast Radio. You're about to listen to an episode of Tech Done Different podcast with Ted Harrington. Do you follow the pack or challenge the status quo? Join Ted as he explores how to succeed by going against conventional wisdom. You'll hear leaders in technology and security tell stories about how they achieve their success by doing things differently. Knowledge is power. Now, more than ever.
CrowdSec, the collaborative and open source cybersecurity solution. Analyze behaviors, respond to attacks, and share signals across the community for free. Let's make the internet safer together. Learn more at crowdsec.net.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Tech Done Different. As always, I'm your host, Ted Harrington, and with me here today is our special guest, Maritza Johnson, the director of a yet-to-be-named center at University of San Diego. Maritza, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about some of the research you've been involved with and observing. And when you and I were talking about where we might take this conversation, you said this really interesting thing that I was like, yeah, we're going to start there. And so I want you to tell me about this idea. You said users are lazy. So can you tell me about that?
Yes. So I want to give a little bit of color. I am a human-centered researcher, security and privacy. So all of my work starts with the question of who are your users? Specifically, bring to mind the people that you need to work with. They're the ones who have the problem that you want to solve, or something that you're doing something in service of. And one of the things that constantly comes up, I think, in the security community is we think that users are lazy. You know, we make jokes about users having weak passwords. We make jokes about people not locking their devices. We make jokes about them falling for phishing attacks because they can't be bothered to check, for the right security indicators and figure out whether they're in the right place before they enter their password. And the thing that I wanted to add to this is that it's not just that users are lazy. I think we're all lazy. Humans are lazy. So yes, users are lazy, but dev teams are lazy too. Software teams are lazy. The designers are lazy. And really, it's not even about being lazy. I think the broader concept here is satisficing. We have some general threshold of what we find acceptable. And as long as we can meet that bar, we kind of go with it. So it's good enough. And it can make it look like we're being lazy when really we're just, it would take too long for us to be perfectionists everywhere.
That's really fascinating. And it triggers this idea that I've heard before. And I don't know if this is too far outside of your area of expertise. If it is, obviously tell me. But I heard somewhere along the way that the reason that humans have this trait that is laziness is not actually a bad thing. It's actually a survival instinct, because what we need to allocate our limited resources of time and attention and, glucose to survival. And so what we do is when we see things that that's not a threat to my survival, I won't care that much about that. Do you think that is true and that's what's playing out and what your research is showing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. One of the fun things about moving from computer science into, taking a dip into human-centered computing, it broadens your mind into the exposure of a lot of other academic disciplines like psychology, cognitive science, behavioral psychology. And I think we're seeing a lot of developments in other fields that tell us more about how humans make decisions. So if you remember a few years ago, Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, was wildly popular. I think the whole basis of all of his research is, highlighting and supporting these highlights with research of all the different ways that humans have heuristics. We use heuristics and biases to help us survive. And once you kind of dig into the details, you realize that they're actually quite rational, right? Could you imagine if we all had to have complete information before we could move forward?
Interesting.
We wouldn't do anything. Actually, it kind of makes me think of COVID, right? Part of what's been so painful over the past year is that we have so much new uncertainty in our lives. And a lot of the uncertainty is under, there are some risks involved that we don't understand either.
Hmm.
And when you can't collect the information necessary to make your decision, it's like you feel anxious, right? It's like you get that weird feeling in your stomach where you're like, oh, what am I supposed to do now?
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. And when we think of bias is almost universally described as a negative thing because it prevents certain types of things. But what I'm hearing you say is that the presence of bias actually enables us to behave, just be humans, I guess, and to be able to make decisions and move forward. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah. I mean, it is. Yeah, I think that's one way to think of it. It's definitely true that in today's conversations, when you hear bias, it has a very negative connotation. But I mean, you also hear it in ways like I've heard folks, a positive use of it is, to say, well, I have a bias toward action. It's like, hire me to be on your team because I have a bias toward action, which is basically saying like you're comfortable moving through uncertainty, which in some positions is great.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right. That's exactly what I was going to say. It's not a bad thing necessarily. So do we think that if we think about this idea of bias, like for example, confirmation bias, right? Where someone goes into a situation anticipating an outcome and then really only sees the data that supports that outcome. I think generally that's referred to as a bad thing because we have these blind spots now. But is what we're saying here that maybe in fact it's not necessarily a bad thing because it's identifying the data that does help us make a decision?
To be honest, I'm not sure. And then I feel like this kind of like starts to like pull on a thread that I've been thinking of a lot lately, which is I think a lot of the interesting spaces we're finding ourselves in lately are very nuanced. And we seem to have a desire to figure out like right or wrong, or is it good or bad? And, like what does it boil down to? Give me the TLDR. I feel like sometimes without having like the full context of, or just more context and kind of more space to think about it, it's unclear, right? So I feel like some biases are like, I guess specifically you asked about confirmation bias. So like in what ways does it serve you and when does it harm you? I feel like depending on the environment, the answer could vary. Like if you're exposed to a mix of high, and if you're exposed to information that is of dubious quality or coming from unreputable sources, then you don't want to be kind of being led along by confirmation bias. You want to keep that kind of critical, slow thinking, pull through the details and see what's there.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
I'm wondering, when would confirmation bias ever be a benefit?
I mean, I guess if you are objectively making the right decision and that bias is just reinforcing that it's the right decision, but you don't, but the problem is that confirmation bias could get in the way of making the right decision because you've already made the assumption. I mean, like flat earthers, right? Yeah. That's the definition of confirmation bias being a bad thing. They're like, the earth is flat. Now let's create scientific experiments to support that. And it's like, it's not really how the scientific method works.
Right.
So tell me about, sorry, no, keep going. Didn't mean to speak over.
I was going to pull it like one level deeper. It's like I think it's undeniable that confirmation bias is a thing that humans are susceptible to. And we do if we're not paying attention to it. And then so I think like to pull it back a layer, then to wonder where, what utility does that serve? So I guess trying to pull it into like evolutionary psychology, like what would be the benefit of confirmation bias? So maybe somebody would argue that it comes down to, like having that strong need to like have a group and to identify with a crowd, like safety in numbers, safety with, your people. I'm not sure. Yeah. I might have taken that one too far. We should probably change.
Hey, we're just exploring it. I did want to, so maybe zoom back out to the broader concept here. I know we were going down this particular rabbit hole, but so you described yourself as you focus on human-centered design. So can you define what human-centered design is and maybe give an example or two of how this plays out in our daily lives? Ideally, a security example would be great, but really any example of what human-centered design is.
Yeah. So one way to think about human-centered design is to think about You are, as a person who's designing a product, designing a system, designing a feature, you are building these things hopefully to help somebody make progress on something that they need to do, right? You're doing something that is meant to be useful, you're doing something to be helpful, you're solving somebody's problem. And so the human-centered design take on that would be identifying the group of people or the person that it is who has the problem that you mean to solve, and working with them in their context to understand what is it that they're doing when they need the thing that you're building. And how do you ensure that what you're building satisfies their needs? So can they complete the task successfully? Can they do it quickly? Can they do it with satisfaction? And so what I've just given you, like those are the facets of kind of the standard definition of usability. Mm-hmm. I think you'll hear, usability or usable security thrown out a lot. So an example of this would be, let's see. So for security, what would be my favorite example of usable security? I think incorporating fingerprint authentication to the unlock button on the iPhone was probably like the best example of usable security when that came out, right? So it's like you had to press this button to like open your phone anyways. And if you could make that thing somebody was already doing also work as a means of authenticating the user, that's a great outcome, right?
Right.
And actually we did some research on this, and up until Apple kind of like made it just super easy for you to lock and unlock your phone with a password with your biometrics. Up until then, a lot of people weren't locking their phones. So it's like, who wants to sit there entering a PIN code every time you want to use your phone? Right. I want to say like people unlock their phone like, so at the time it was maybe like 30 times a day. I feel like today it's probably like every 5 minutes. Right. But it adds up a lot, right? If you have to type in your PIN every time, whereas with fingerprint, it's super easy. Mm-hmm. And then like the next revolution on that would be, okay, well now we have the face unlock. But with COVID, like all of a sudden what felt like it could be usable. Now with COVID and people wearing masks, it's a lot less usable. So it's, I guess just to say, it's like, it's not always straightforward.
Right. It's interesting you brought up that particular innovation, because that was what was kicking around in the back of my mind on this topic. Because I remember that moment in time so vividly when there were so many people just don't lock their phone. And now all of a sudden it's like, well, I guess it's easy, so I'll do it. And now all of a sudden everybody locks, like everybody. It's really rare to find someone who doesn't lock their phone now because it's so easy. And so what are the principles that we can extrapolate or extract out of that? Is it that the user's workflow, so to speak, was unchanged? Is that really the key difference here?
Yeah, I think to me, the one overriding principle that I think applies in a lot of places is, especially in security, you want the most secure way to do something in what you build should be the path of least resistance. It's almost like water, right? Like users going to flow through the thing that's easiest for them to do. And as the system designer and the builder, the developer, I feel like it is your job to, in as many ways as possible, make that experience so that they don't have to go out of their way to seek security.
Mm-hmm. When we think about something like multi-factor authentication, that is a dramatic improvement in security versus not having it. I mean, like one of the signature innovations in security is certainly multi-factor authentication, but most people hate it because it's an extra step. But one thing I've noticed that Apple does, I imagine, I don't know if Android OS does it, I'm sure they do, but Apple has it so that when you're like on your mobile phone, you're logging to whatever service and then it sends the text, it will actually give you the opportunity right there in the predictive texting to say, do you want to enter this code that just came in from a text message? You don't even have to change out of the app. That seems like an example too, of where it's, I wouldn't say it's necessarily the least resistance because you do still have to click one more button, but you don't have to exit the app. You don't have to do anything else. And it does approximate the security benefit. Does that sound like human-centered design?
Yeah, that sounds just like it. And this example reminds me of there's a, I'm not sure what folks would call this feature, but it's basically like when you're in the middle of a sign up flow and you receive the SMS with the confirmation code. I guess, sorry, it's the experience that you're just describing. Before OS developers, before the platforms were making it possible to just like have that code, like straight in the, actually, so I guess then they put it in the clipboard, right? Or maybe they don't necessarily have to store it in the clipboard.
I'm actually not sure how it works.
Now I'm distracting myself.
But now I want to go find out.
That could be a vulnerability too, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, well, but then iOS also added this new notification that tells you, like, app just access the clipboard.
Right.
So maybe, but anyway, so I was working on a product team where we were designing a new sign-up flow, and we had a feature in there where in the sign-up flow, the OS would go and grab the confirmation code for you. But it didn't do it seamlessly. It went from the app that you were using to sign up, hopped over to SMS, hopped back, and filled it in. Which, if you're on a brand new phone with the most recent OS update, works great. It's seamless. However, if you're on a laggy network or on an older phone, it's not quite so slick. And people get really confused. So part of me being a human-centered researcher is I do a lot of usability testing and meeting directly with people, hearing about how they experience technology, asking questions about their needs, figuring out, like, how does this work for you? What do you think of blah? When you see this, what happens? What do you think? And so we did some in-person usability testing of this flow. And we were there testing it because we couldn't figure out why 40% of people weren't making it through the sign-up flow, which is a huge number, right?
Yeah,
like only
huge.
60% of people are successfully creating an account. It's not at all what you want. And so once we got in person, we saw this happening. It was like, oh, yeah, it turns out if your phone is jumping around across a bunch of different screens and you have no idea what's happening, it's like, did I create an account? I don't know. Okay, well, like my phone's being unreliable. Let me quit and try again. And it just keeps happening. Like people would try it like 5 to 10 times before they're just like, okay.
Right.
So I think just to say, like, as an example, convenience isn't, just because it's convenient or slick doesn't necessarily make it usable.
That's an interesting distinction, because in my mind, they were sort of synonymous. But what I'm hearing you say is they are actually two distinct things, and ideally they go together, but not necessarily.
Yes, that's right. Like, don't over-index on trying to like kind of over-optimize for what you think would be an ideal experience, unless you're testing it with people.
So for sake of clarity, what would be the difference, if we were going to define them, between convenience and usability?
So usability has to be measured in terms of who is it, what is it that they're trying to do, and are they able to successfully complete that task? And being able to do it in a timely manner is part of that. But at the end of the day, correctness has to outweigh simplicity. And then even as I say that, it's like, okay, but like for how many tasks that we do, does correctness really, is it the most important factor? So for creating a new account, like correctly creating an account, like that's very important, depending on the account, of course. Whereas maybe, I'm trying to think of an example where correctness would be, you have some like wiggle room. Nothing's coming up for me.
Well, I can think of an example where, well, maybe you can analyze this example for me. One of the examples that I think is great when it works is if someone's using a password manager and they have the browser extension installed. And so when they're creating an account using that browser with the extension installed, and they, enter the username they want to use, the password they want to use, and then the password manager will be like, bloop, do you want to create an account in your password manager? And you can just say yes. So all in one motion, you've created the account, you've logged it to your password manager, and you're good to go. That I think is a really great workflow. It is very simple for most users. It makes them actually use security products like password managers, which have their issues too, no doubt about it, but they're better than not using one. But where it bricks is that not every service works that way. And so when you go into that workflow, you just created an account and you don't get the pop-up and you're like, oh shoot, I just created an account. I don't know what the username is or the password because I thought it was going to create there. So what's your take on that workflow?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm wanting to pull it back to where we started of like who's being lazy in this case. So I understand modern web development is a huge pain in the ass. It's super hard to make something that works with all browsers. And especially once you're throwing in like a bunch of different browsers and a bunch of different plugins and making sure that everything works. However, for the sake of everybody, I wish that site developers paid more attention to having a standardized workflow for sign-in flows that actually worked with password managers. So I think one of like the canonical examples here would be sites that think that they're doing users a favor or doing something secure by making it by disabling the ability to paste into a password field.
Right. Yeah.
It's awful, right? Like it's awful. So things like that. I feel like these are, I don't like to play the blame game on usability things, but the blame there is squarely on the folks who designed it. Like you can't blame users for that one. So like I get it, and that's a thing. And so on this one, I mean, all right, so coping in the world where we live, where websites are implementing these forms in a variety of ways, and as a user, we have to cope with it. Then you got to look on the other side. So for the designers of the password manager, how do we make it so that users can easily detect when they're in the situation before it's too late?
Oh, that's interesting.
So being able to like gracefully recover if you're in uncharted territory. So that'd be one. Going back to the folks who built the website that you're trying to sign into, I think we've seen a lot of changes in password recovery. So when it's easy to recover your password, it's kind of, okay, well, at least I have a way to get through this.
Yeah, right.
So
just an annoying few extra steps, but yeah.
Right.
But yeah, at least you're not sunk. Like we get calls pretty frequently actually from people who created their cryptocurrency wallets and then lost their recovery phrases. And they're can you come hack my wallet so I can, and we're like, it just doesn't work this way. So sorry.
Yeah.
But yeah, in that case, there's no recovery.
Right. I mean, in some ways that points to, I think, one of the things that we see often, like this is a reason why I don't wholeheartedly recommend to everybody that they turn on two-factor if it's an option. So if you turn on two-factor for a personal account and don't have a strategy for managing your recovery mechanisms, and I've personally told you to turn on two-factor, you're going to be really pissed off when you get locked out of your account and you realize that there's no recovery option. So I think two-factor in an environment where you have a system administrator who can help you with recovery is one thing. Two-factor for personal accounts where folks aren't understanding the additional requirement that they have a recovery mechanism that they've set up and also maintain it. It's a little tough to recommend as a security person.
Right. Yeah, that's actually really fascinating to hear the case against multi-factor, but not about convenience. That's not what you're saying. You're not saying, oh, it's annoying, so don't use multi-factor, which is what pretty much everybody feels about multi-factor. But you're saying if you get locked out or whatever, and you haven't managed the way you're going to recover from that, you might be sunk. That account just might be dead. Yeah, that's really fascinating.
It's well, I guess it's one way to reduce the number of people asking me for security advice, but it's not something I want to be doing.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned that you were involved with, you did some research related to Facebook. I think it was around their API and everything was happening with Cambridge Analytica, which, was a big story around the election. Could you tell me a little bit about that research and some of the things that came out of that? I think you were describing privacy as an access control issue, maybe?
Yeah, so I was telling you, I feel like I kind of had an interesting path into how I ended up focused on privacy. So I went from general computer science to usable security to finding my way into like, wow, privacy is a fascinating area, and I want to spend all of my time thinking about this and figuring out how we can do it better, which is a bit of a dramatic shift. So the thing that was at the crux of this was when I was a grad student, I was interested in how do people manage security policies. So actually, my advisor, he wrote the book on firewalls, Steve Belvin, and so one of his kind of research interests as it had always been, it's one thing to build security mechanisms, but for anything that you build, people will be managing it. So people will be managing the system on behalf of other people. So you can't ignore the human element. So you're interested in access control. How do people manage access control policies? Turns out when you're a grad student, there aren't a lot of organizations that are interested in sharing their potentially buggy or insufficient access control policies with grad students. And so I had to find a different way to explore the problem and to measure it. So this was back in 2010, 2011. And I was working with an undergrad, and we got really interested in, so Michelle and I got really interested in whether or not people were like, are your Facebook privacy settings correct? So at the time you could, you were using Facebook, people are sharing photos, posts, a bunch of different content. So if you think about it, your friends in your Facebook network are the subjects. You have the content that you've shared on Facebook as the objects. And you had a little bit of control to say who could see what or who could comment on what. And so we were wondering, are people correctly managing their Facebook privacy settings? So of course, as soon as you pose that question, you quickly realize, well, there's no objective notion of correctness for Facebook settings. It depends on who you're talking to, what their goals are, and how they'd like to use Facebook. So maybe you have somebody, like, for example, I could imagine for your podcast, Ted, you're in promotion mode, right? You want everybody to see the content. So that's one way of using it. So then maybe correctness for you would be everything's open and getting as much exposure as possible. Whereas maybe another user is using it just to share their family pictures. So maybe they, mostly want to keep things shut down and shared with family. So there are two different, there are a lot of different patterns how you would want to use it. So at the time I guess we got kind of lucky because Facebook had recently released their API. And so using the API, we discovered that we could design our survey as a Facebook app, programmatically ask the questions that we wanted to ask, measure how do people want to share their data, and then use the API to check what were the audience permissions on individual pieces of content. And then we could go back to the same person and say, hey, you said this, but it turns out here's how you're sharing in reality. What do you think? Like, are you going to go in and change your settings? Do you have questions? What are you going to do? So the thing that I think is, there are a lot of interesting things about the study. So first of all, the findings. Of all the people that we surveyed, I think we surveyed about 70 people. Every single person had at least one example of kind of what we had deemed a sensitive piece of information shared with the wrong group that had some sensitivity. So in general, we thought like, okay, this is just a crazy thing to ask people to do. Like people aren't, they're not positioned to get this right. So that was one thing. Another thing that it got me interested in was the sheer power of the API. So basically, like the way that the API was built such that the way we were able to kind of check to see what people's permissions actually were was that we got kind of access. We got a token that was accessed as the user who had installed the app to go through and programmatically check through all of their content on Facebook and check the permissions. So basically, like this is the same functionality that Cambridge Analytica used to download, to create a huge trove of data about people who had installed the app. And it was, so Cambridge Analytica became known in 2018. So we were doing this research back in 2011. Even at the time, I remember thinking like, wait a minute. Okay, so we have these access tokens, we have this data. We're security researchers, so we know how to do this properly. It was a study that we got reviewed by the Institutional Review Board at Columbia, which is the research ethics committee. And they're there for human subjects research. You're collecting data about people. They're there for the protection of human subjects. Mm-hmm. And when you're doing an online study with a lot of data, one of the things that they would advise on would be, are you adequately protecting that data? And I remember it was of course a big conversation for the research team, Michelle, Steve, and I, to talk about how are we doing this? What was our plan? What was our security plan? I remember being like, okay, Steve is fantastically well-known person in the security field. He's literally graybeard. Like, not every research team has a security expert
right
on it. It's like, there is no way that these studies of this flavor, which were getting pretty popular at the time, there's no way there's adequate security mechanisms and protections in place for the data. So then, fast forward to 2018, Cambridge Analytica happens. And I'm just like, oh yeah, like, I'm sure that there are more examples like that out there of researchers collecting data and not having an adequate data protection policy in place. But yeah, kind of a lot in there.
Right.
It kind of like set the scene for the rest of my career. It's just like, there's a lot here. There are a lot of decisions being made that have implications.
There's so many elements and themes that come out of that I think are really fascinating. But maybe the first one to observe, I guess, is this idea that in the pursuit of security research, you identified a problem, and that problem, and when you were doing it, it was research. And so in essence, hypothetical. It wasn't hypothetical because you proved that it was a problem, but no one had necessarily exploited it to your knowledge. And then fast forward not that many years later, and all of a sudden it's like this catastrophic problem that really, in essence, undermined our democratic process. And in so many ways, the reason I want to point that out is that I feel that a lot of times what happens with security research is the subject being researched is like, no one would do that.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. But they do.
But then they do.
Yeah.
Exactly what you just said. I feel like that was like in the air with the Snowden revelations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, there were a ton of security folks sitting around being like, yeah, in my wildest dreams, I kind of thought this sort of thing was happening, but even for me, that was a little too like tinfoil hatty.
Yeah. I
was like, no. Turns out it's a thing.
Fair enough. That's funny. Well, Maritza, you've been awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all of these insights and wisdom. I'm super fascinated by the concept of human-centered design. I'm definitely going to read up on it now that you've triggered so many thoughts in me. As we finish up, is there any last thing that you want to leave with our audience?
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's a great question. I'll leave you with two things. So I have two current projects that I'm really excited about. One is this new center that I'm starting at USD. So it is data science, AI, and society. And I'm really excited to kind of create a space where we're having a rich conversation about the adoption of technology. So how do we make it accessible to more people? How do we bring in more voices? How do we, I think really change the trajectory that we're on? So look forward to that space, and yes, follow me on Twitter or check out my website for updates. Actually, I'll leave it at that. It's good.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to hear how it goes. And as a resident of San Diego myself, I want to come check it out once you got it going. So thank you so much.
I would love that.
Yeah. We'll connect for sure. Well, thanks for being on the show, and thank everyone for listening. If you want to learn more about what Maritza's up to or request to appear on the show yourself, just go to tedharrington.com/podcast, and we'll catch you next time.
CrowdSec, the collaborative and open source cybersecurity solution. Analyze behaviors, respond to attacks, and share signals across the community for free. Let's make the internet safer together. Learn more at crowdsec.net.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Tech Done Different podcast with Ted Harrington. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.